Good evening and welcome to HemiScope. I'm Peter Smith, the Director of Latin American Studies here at the University of California, San Diego. Tonight we offer a preview of the presidential election to be held in Mexico this coming July the 2nd. With just days to go in this campaign, the three candidates are traipsing across the country, making their final appeals to the voters. This race is viewed by many as the first truly free election in Mexican history, and polls show two of the candidates in a dead heat. We'll talk about all this in a moment, right after we get a look at the three leading men who would be president of Mexico. The first is Francisco Labastida, candidate of the PRI, the institutional revolutionary party which has dominated Mexican politics for more than 70 years. Labastida, a former state governor and top-level cabinet minister in Mexico, was thought to be the favorite when the campaign began. In his mind, he still is.
We are going to win. I apologize for having to repeat this in a confident manner. The candidate Labastida is going to win by a comfortable margin of votes against the second and third placed candidates.
Closing in on Labastida is Vicente Fox, the former governor of the state of Guanajuato and the nominee of the PAN, or National Action Party. As a challenger who represents a real threat to the PRI, Fox fears potential fraud at the ballot box.
We don't trust Cedillo, Labastida, or the PRI, which still will maneuver to stay in power after 70 years. So we have defensive team and actions to prevent as much as possible irregularities, illegalities, immoralities.
Third is Cuauhtemoc Cardenas of the PRD, or Party of the Democratic Revolution. He is the former mayor of Mexico City and the son of a former president of Mexico. Like Fox, Cardenas is running against the PRI.
Que debemos realizar y que tienen que ver con la construcción, como aquí se señala.
We want to build a democratic political regime. We want a government where there is no violence, no controversy. We want to get away from a government where repression is seen as the norm in everyday governmental policies.
Norme, o lo que caracterice, mejor dicho.
Fox tried to persuade Cardenas to drop out in order to strengthen the opposition's chances of defeating the PRI, but Cardenas refused. The candidate who receives the most votes on Sunday will become the next president of Mexico. My guests tonight are Kenneth Greene, a doctoral candidate in political science at the University of California, Berkeley, who studies campaigns in Mexico, and Sallie Hughes, a former journalist and now a PhD candidate at Tulane University. They are both visiting scholars here at UCSD. Welcome, Sallie. And Ken, let me start with you and ask about the background of this campaign. We often think of Mexico as a one-party system or a one-party state. Actually, there are a lot of parties and there have been a lot of candidates. Can you tell us a little bit about how this campaign is shaped up?
Sure. For about the past 15 years, Mexico has been moving toward a multi-party system. Now there are 5 candidates, only 3 with real possibilities. Those are, as you mentioned, Vicente Fox, whose National Action Party heads up a coalition called Alliance for Change that also has the Greene Party involved in it. The other opposition candidate is Cuauhtemoc Cardenas, whose PRD party, or Party of the Democratic Revolution, has a small coalition with a couple of other parties. The only other really important party is the Workers' Party. And then the third candidate, of course, is Labastida from the PRI.
Does this range of parties really span a left-right spectrum? I mean, can you place Cardenas on the left, and is Fox really on the right? Is the PRI in the middle? Or is it not that simple or not that complicated?
It's both that simple and that complicated. In fact, there is a left-right spectrum. Cardenas is on the center-left. Fox is on the center-right. Labastida mostly plays kind of a centrist game. It's a little bit more complicated in the sense that these two parties, the PAN and the PRD, are in the opposition. So they often split their votes. And we've seen lately that Fox has been trying to take over a bit of the center-left vote. Now that he's won most of the opposition vote and is leading in the polls, he's trying to move toward the left, get Cardenas's voters.
Well, would it have been possible for Cardenas on the left and Fox on the right to make an alliance? There were discussions of a pact. Are the ideological differences between these two parties so strong that it's just not possible, or the personal antagonisms? Why could there not be an oppositionist alliance against this ruling monolith called the PRI?
It's a great question. I think that if there had been an opposition alliance, they could have defeated the PRI. And as you mentioned in the introduction, Fox has been pressuring Cardenas to give his votes to him. There are a number of reasons why it didn't happen. One has to do with the party finance laws. It would have diminished their finances terribly had they allied before the election.
That is, the alliances, the finances of the PRD?
Yes.
Or of the opposition alliance?
Of the opposition alliance in total. They would have received the finances of the largest party, and in fact the PRD gets the most finances right now from public monies. So they would have been the party with all the money. Now the other reasons are, of course, ego plays some role, but I think there really are ideological differences that have been kind of scuttled in this debate over why no opposition alliance.
And how do ideological differences show up in the campaign? What are the issues? What are people talking about, and how are these coalitions positioning themselves on the issues?
Well, the issues haven't really come up all that much, in the sense that the economic issues haven't. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Fox is leading. Fox's National Action Party is it's a fiscally conservative, free market-oriented party. It wants to follow the policies that the last 3 PRI administrations have followed, so I don't expect that there'd be much change if he wins. Now that means that there isn't much of an interest in bringing up economic policy issues in the debate between Labastida and Fox. Cardenas hasn't done a great job of kind of elbowing those issues into the debate. He's been pretty quiet on most of the economic issues.
Well, is it just now that Mexico's economy seems to be doing well right now? I mean, don't issues of equity and poverty and fairness and social justice continue to persist, or do they simply get washed out in the heat of a campaign?
They certainly do persist, and they persist at the rhetorical level. The PRI has been great at bringing those issues in over the years, but I don't see any real proposals for bringing back the type of collective benefits that workers used to have in the past. At best, there's kind of weak talk of expanding targeted social programs and using subsidies when they won't upset the fiscal balance.
Sallie, you're an expert on the media. How are these candidates trying to use the media? Are they offering a lot of spots that try to stake out positions on issues, or are they simply promoting their own personalities? What's going on in the media campaign?
Well, you asked about spots, and you really have to divide the media in 2 ways, between paid advertisement and news coverage, as well as the type of media. Advertising is now available to all the top 3 parties and coalitions, and that's a change due to some legal reforms in 1996. In fact, we have some estimates that the top 3 parties alone are spending about $1 million every 15 days on advertising.
And that's a lot in Mexico.
That's a lot.
That's real money in Mexico.
That's
right.
real money in Mexico. Televisa, the top-ranked network, is charging about $27,000 for a 20-second primetime spot. And yes, that's real money. In fact, the IFE, the electoral organization, the electoral bureaucracy that's organizing the election.
Instituto Federal Electoral.
Exactly. Estimates that about 75% of campaign budgets are going into advertising. That's very important for the opposition because we're starting to get studies out by the IFE, a Mexican human rights group on behalf of the UN, the Reforma newspaper group, all showing that there's a strong slant in television and radio news coverage. So advertising is a way that the opposition can counteract that to a certain degree.
What's that slant? Is it with regard to degree of coverage of the opposition or the content of coverage, or both?
It's both. What they found was in the first few months of this year, coverage was fairly balanced and split between the top 3 presidential candidates. But as we entered March and April, it became more and more slanted in favor of the pre-candidate, Labastida, and it's now, from the latest IFE numbers, it's about 2-to-1 in terms of time in favor of Labastida over Fox, and even more so in favor of Labastida over Cardenas. Now, there's been some interesting analysis of message and tone as well, and you also find that in terms of negative and positive coverage, the balance is much more toward the PRI than the opposition. So the opposition has turned to advertising like never before, in part because they have the money, and in part to counteract the negative broadcast coverage.
And is this going to work? Are Mexican elections going to be played out in the way that U.S. elections are played out, with TV bites and campaigns that are really filtered through TV? Is TV and television now the predominant medium of political competition, or do radio and the print media continue to play a role, or does the media as a whole not play such a big role?
Well, we need more information on that. The answer that's usually given is that TV has powerful effects. But I think when you have a situation such as Mexico, where you're getting coverage that is heavily slanted, people are going to rely on other forms of information as well. Newspapers have shown increasing autonomy and assertiveness in their coverage over the last 10 years. And people turn to other forms of information. It could be colleagues, their priest. The church has become increasingly vocal in its statements on the election, not for or against a candidate, but definitely for a free vote. Workplace. So there's other sources of information than just television and radio. And within television and radio, there's some variation too. It's interesting to look at those numbers. You see that at a state level, where opposition parties at the national level are now controlling state governorships, you see more balanced coverage. And so, at least in terms of local news, you can get a wider range of news. So there's other sources of information. I think what will happen is that Mexicans with access to wide-ranging sources of information will be able to make a vote decided on the candidate, the party, their ideology, et cetera. And those who don't may be led by information that's slanted toward continued pre-rule.
Ken, what's your sense of the calculations that a Mexican voter makes? That is it processing of information? Is it tradition? Is it family lineage? Is it the sense that there may not be other alternatives? Is it simply anger against the PRI, and I'm going to vote for whoever's against the PRI? That is, do we have a sense of the kind of calculus that's going to go on in the voting booth or on the way to the voting booth that voters are going to bring this coming Sunday on the 2nd of July?
I think it's all of the above. The PRI certainly has a bit of a captive electorate, people that have voted for the party out of tradition. I think that's about a third of its electorate currently. The PRI also gets a lot of votes from people who don't have much education, tend to be toward the poorer stratus of society, and vote for these candidates partly because of the promises they make. In fact, there's a big portion of their vote that comes from social assistance funds. Then there is somewhat of an ideological electorate, a more educated electorate that chooses the party based on their program. Finally, there are some interesting age effects. Young people seem to be interested in change. The 20 to 30-year-old population is voting for the PAN mostly and a little bit for the PRD. The older folks, above 50, are going for the PRI.
And Sallie, we've heard that there are some U.S. consultants or consultancies have been brought in to kind of help manage the campaign and particularly the media parts. Are these media campaigns focusing on issues or personalities? Is it simply to try to get pictures of Vicente Fox out in front of the public or Cuauhtemoc Cardenas, or are these things targeted on issues that in some ways would separate the candidates and give voters a kind of choice over issues rather than people? We have a sense, at least in the U.S. media coverage, that Fox is this powerful personality, and that seems to be driving the campaign. But is that true, or are they trying to simply play up the personalities or focus on issues?
Well, let me give you an anecdote about Fox. The National Association of Hispanic Journalists in the U.S. had their regional meeting in Mexico City in March, and all the candidates came. Well, Fox came to the cocktail party and spoke to them all in English, and apparently he went over far better than any of the others. So he definitely has a charisma, at least in the way the foreign correspondents see it. He's able to joke easily with them and speak to them in English. Labastida apparently doesn't speak English very well. You'd hope that foreign correspondents would speak Spanish, but they don't always do. In terms of the advertisements, you've seen a mix. There has been some issue-oriented advertising. The one that comes to mind actually didn't go over very well. It was Labastida promising computers and English classes to all the children of Mexico, and the response was, well, they need to learn to read and write first. But
and besides, the forces of globalization are not always positive, so
right.
Maybe we could stave them off for a while.
Right. But there have been issue-oriented advertisements. Unfortunately, the ones that have had the most echo, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, have been the ads that focus on regime change. The Pen has been extremely effective in using that card. And in fact, in advertisements that ran just before the pre-primary last year, brought up former Mexican presidents, cited them directly with very grandiose promises of change, and then asked Mexicans had they had enough. And that's the type of ad that's having the biggest impact. It's not candidate focused, but it's definitely got a high-profile tone to it.
Is that your sense too, Ken, that the issue in some ways is change and let's try to get the pre-out? In some ways, Labastida is in a very awkward position. He promotes himself as a candidate of change, and yet he's a candidate of the regime, and it's, some would say, a difficult if not contradictory position. But is that your sense too, that maybe the whole thing simply boils down to let's get the rascals out and get a clean start in this new millennium?
Well, that certainly advantages Fox. He wants to make this a plebiscite. It's a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the PRI. The PRI is used to playing this kind of a game. They promise change and sometimes deliver some sorts of change, and have over the past 20 years always promised that kind of a change. This kind of a campaign disadvantages Cardenas the most. He's lost the battle to become the candidate of change. Fox has won it, and that's what the election is turning on right now.
Sallie, let me ask you about U.S. coverage of this campaign, media coverage. You're a professional journalist. What do you think? Is it biased? Is it so fascinated with the figure of Fox that it's kind of missing a lot of big issues? Are we getting accurate information from our own media about this campaign as it shapes up?
I think there's a certain fascination with Fox, and it's a bit of an underdog effect. And it's a bit of also his media campaign people doing a good job. My criticism of the coverage of Mexico has always been that there's not enough depth, and I think that's probably being reflected in the electoral coverage today. We don't really understand how Mexico got into the situation it is now, what the different groups are in Mexico. There's many Mexicans, not just a middle class and not just an upper class that speaks English. So that's probably being reflected in the electoral coverage we're seeing today.
We'll take a close look in the days ahead. Thank you both. Next up, what the polls mean for the candidates and for the incumbent president, Ernesto Zedillo. We'll be right back. Joining me now is Andres Villarreal, a doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago. He is also a visiting scholar at UCSD's Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies. Welcome, Andres. Let me ask you about polls in this campaign. Polls seem to be playing a major part in the attention that is given to the campaign and to the development of campaign strategies. What are polls like in Mexico? Can we trust the results? Are they accurate or are they impressionistic?
Well, I think polling in Mexico has improved a lot in recent years. There's now well over a dozen or so polling organizations nationally, and they're quite sophisticated, some of them in their sampling techniques, and they've improved quite a bit. What's interesting in this election has been the amount of debate over polls themselves. I think precisely because one of the leading candidates, Fox, has made it such a point that he is the only candidate who can win, the only opposition candidate who can win the elections. He relies on polls, and that has led some of the members of the PRI to question these polls. So there's been a lot of debate about it.
And the questioning would be on the basis of who answers the polls, if they're carried out, say, by telephone rather than by in-home interviews, or on the street rather than at home. What are the kinds of issues that are involved here?
That's right. The most serious polls are obviously carried out interviews in homes, but there are also some polls that are where people are questioned in the streets or called on the phones. And of course, if people are questioned on the phones, there's a substantial bias, because you tend to cover people who have telephones and tend to be in urban areas and of higher incomes.
Right, and there are a lot of citizens in Mexico who do not have telephones.
That's right.
So you miss a lot of people.
That's right, and I would say the other difference will be in polling would be the sampling techniques, how well they cover rural areas and larger cities, whether they cover all 32 states or 31 states plus a federal district in Mexico.
Let me ask you this question before we move on to the content of polls. Who carries them out? Are they private polling organizations? Are they attached to newspapers? Are they private foundations? Is there any university center for public opinion research of the sort that we have here in the United States that kind of sets a standard for public opinion polling, or do they tend to be privatized in a sense in Mexico?
I think they, on the most part, they tend to be privatized. There are some that are affiliated with universities to more or less degree, and universities are oftentimes serves as depositories of these polls. But on the whole, I'd say they're private. They're often commissioned either by parties or by various groups like newspapers, television stations.
One of the most respected polls is the Reforma poll, carried out by a friend of mine and former student of mine, so therefore the best. But it tends to show over the months that Labastida's support has dropped from around 48% to, say, 42%. That Fox, for all of the attention given in the media to his surge, has stayed relatively steady, around 39 or 40%, and that Cuauhtemoc Cardenas, who everyone has dismissed, has actually moved up from, say, 12 to 18%. Is that, you think, a generally accurate picture of the trends in this campaign, that this is more or less where we stand, and that Labastida and Fox are, for all practical and statistical intents and purposes, in pretty much of a dead heat right now?
Yeah, I would say most polls indicate about that kind of difference. Most polls indicate the kind of Labastida slightly ahead of Fox, although there are some in which Fox is slightly ahead. But they're usually within what's called the margin of error of the polls, so it's statistically difficult to distinguish who is actually ahead. So that's correct.
And we've heard so much about opposition to the PRI. In the previous segment, Ken Greene and Sallie Hughes were talking about this sort of surge of resentment against the PRI and how in some ways the issue is the PRI. It's not a specific issue, but it's really let's get the rascals out. If that's so, where does Labastida get his support? Who is likely to be the base of the vote for the PRI, according to at least the polling results that we see now?
Well, according to the polls, Labastida and the PRI in general has most of its support in rural areas, among the older population as opposed to the younger population. Interestingly enough, there's also a very large gender gap in the electorate right now. And for some reason, Labastida is further ahead from Fox among women voters. In the latest Reforma poll, there's a 12% difference among women, women's preference between those two candidates, with Labastida receiving a larger percentage of the votes. And that gender gap, however, has decreased substantially, I would say. Back in January, the gender gap was 23% difference. And this, I think, has been partly due to Fox's strategy of targeting women, both in ads, in the debates. He's hammering that.
Well, let's come back to that. In some ways, the mere existence of a gender gap is surprising. One often thinks that Mexican women do what their men tell them to do. So what we're seeing clearly, whatever the extent of the gap, particularly in the early phases of the campaign, a real sort of autonomy and independence on the part of women as they at least decide their political preferences. Secondly, one might have thought that initially, Fox being a kind of burly macho guy, representing a conservative party with roots to the Catholic Church, that he might actually have an intrinsic advantage in dealing with women over the PRI. Why didn't he have that advantage, or has he squandered it, or is he making up for the disadvantage in the recent parts of the campaign?
Well, it's hard to say really from the polling results what could be driving this. Perhaps it is Fox's style is turning some women voters away. But I think this reflects a larger pattern in which the PRI in general has often received larger support from women. There are those some analysts who argue that this may be a commonality among other countries as well, where women voters tend to be slightly more conservative, staying with the status quo. I'm not so sure.
Well, I think you're right that cross-national public opinion research tends to make that one of its principal findings. We'll see in the case of Mexico. Now, let me ask you about President Ernesto Zedillo. When we first began HemiScope, our first program was about Zedillo and a report card on Zedillo in the early stages of his administration, when he was having all kinds of trouble after the peso crisis and trying to build his legitimacy, and he wasn't very strong in the party. Now, Cedillo is riding these incredibly high presidential approval polls, around 67%. What accounts for that? How did he manage to do it?
Well, that's a great question, actually. I think part of it might be the economic performance. The economy has improved substantially since the beginning of his sexennial. He began his first year in office with one of the worst economic crises in recent history. And as the polls show that as the negative opinions of the economy, that is people's opinion of their own personal economic situation as well as the national economic situation, as those negative opinions have decreased, his approval rate has steadily increased. So economic performance might explain some of it. However, my own work in presidential approval during the presidency of Carlos Salinas prior to Cedillo.
Work, I might say, carried out when you were a master's student here at UCSD.
That's right. And also more recent work on that people have done on the Cedillo presidency shows that economic performance in and of itself can't explain all the variation in its approval rate. What's puzzling is that what I found during the Salinas presidency is that a large part of his approval was due to the enormous expectations he generated from very ambitious social and economic projects he initiated. Projects such as Pronasol, the National Solidarity Program, and even the Free Trade Agreement with the U.S.
Now, let me ask you this. Cedillo was riding the 67% approval rating. Labastida, although he's ahead in the race, is only getting 42%. Why is there not some kind of coattail effect? Why can Labastida not ride Ernesto Cedillo's coattails into office?
Well, I think part of it is that both Labastida and Cedillo have been trying to distance themselves to some extent for the following reasons. Cedillo obviously doesn't want to be perceived as influencing the election too much and therefore discrediting it. But
that's also for his own legacy, right? I mean, he is now positioning himself to be the president who brought democracy to Mexico.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. And Labastida, on his part, I think there's to some extent an attempt to distance himself, to take some of the argument away from Fox, who wants to portray himself as a candidate of change, and Labastida as the successor of Cedillo.
Now, let me make an observation and then close with one question. The observation is that this is going to be a pretty close election, at least if we can believe the polls. Vicente Fox has said that he will not accept a pre-victory of less than 10 points. It looks like there's no way, if the polls are in any way correct, that the margin is going to be more than 10 points. And in fact, some of us would have said that if the margin is more than 10 points, that shows there is fraud rather than the absence of fraud. But let me ask you this. As you come down to the bottom line, who do you think is going to win?
I think most polls now would show that Labastida is likely to win, but it's hard to predict for the following reason, that there's still a large percentage of undecided voters that are not taken into account in these percentages.
And a lot of it will depend not on voter preferences, but on turnout. On that note, my good friend, thank you, Andres. That wraps it up for this season of HemiScope. We wish you a pleasant summer, and we'll see you back here in September. I'm Peter Smith. Thank you, and good night.